Once again, thank you for joining our training today. We're going to talk about infant brain development and all of the incredible and fantastic things that go on inside of the infant brain during those first 12 to 18 months of life. Such a critical time for the infant when it comes to development and when it comes to creating the blueprint for learning and how the child will learn. So we always talk about, what all happens in the infant room really sets the child up for success. And a lot of times in early education programs, not enough attention is given to creating that blueprint during those early stages. The infant room is kind of perceived as that classroom where we're just going to take care of the kids' basic needs and do as little as possible with them. But in reality, what goes on in the infant room, is just as important or more important than your preschool and your pre-K classrooms. Now, you don't have a structured curriculum when it comes to, the infant program. You want to base all of your activities on each individual child and their developmental needs. But, it's definitely not to be said that this classroom is not as important as other classrooms that are out there. It's a very critical classroom when we talk about development. Here are the 6 things that I want to talk about in our short time together today. We're going to talk a lot about connections and relationships and what that does for brain development and how critical it is for brain development, especially when we talk about consistency of care. When someone chooses to work in an infant program, it is so critical that they make a commitment to those children, a commitment to the program, and it's a long-term commitment. When I hire infant teachers for my programs, I always like to get a 1-year commitment that they're going to be with me and they're going to be in that classroom. And that's not for my purpose, but that is for the infant's benefit. Same thing with enrolling children. Whenever we tour a program to a new family, before I enroll that family, I really want to make sure that we are the right place for that family, because once they enroll, they've got to give it a 1-year commitment. And again, that's not for my benefit, that's for the child's benefit, because that consistency of care is critical for social and emotional development. And we'll talk about that more as we go on. The second objective, we'll talk about attachment figures and what it means to be an attachment figure. I'm not going to go in too much detail because I have a whole other training just on attachment figures. We're going to talk about play in the infant room and how play supports brain development and the appropriate types of play that we want to focus on. 6 different types of play that are critical for the development of children. We'll talk about interacting with children and what that does for brain development, how the child learns about the outside world, and then I want to introduce you to a new term called Brexting and talk a little bit about Brexting as we move along. So those are my learning objectives for this particular training. I do not have any handouts for this particular training, so if you're looking there at the materials tab, there's no materials for this particular training. I want you to take notes on what is important to you, and I definitely want you to take notes on what you can do to better your infant program so that the brain is developed correctly and we can set these children up for success. All right. Sometimes whenever I provide handouts, people get more focused on what I wrote down on my handout rather than what's important to you. So for some topics, I like to keep it open-ended for a particular reason. All right, let's go ahead and get started with our 6 items that we want to talk about today. And let's talk about connections and relationships. Now, if you are taking notes right now, and I hope you are taking notes, there's one thing I want you to write down. Write this down. Connections on the outside build connections on the inside. Okay, and I'm going to say that again. Connections on the outside build connections on the inside. So when we talk about infant brain development and the trillions, billions, and trillions of connections that are made in the brain, it really all comes down to relationships. The relationship that the child builds with the caregiver, the relationship the child builds with the attachment figure, the parent, and the relationship with other children in the setting. Relationships really is the foundation right here. And so when we look at staffing an infant classroom in our early education programs, finding individuals that are nurturing individuals that create that secure attachment style is imperative. And the more connections that we can build during the first 12 months, the better off the child will be. This is where I was talking about at the beginning, that you've got to have the consistency of care, the same caregiver over and over again for that child. What we have learned is that when children have inconsistent caregivers, so you have a lot of turnover in the classroom, you have the child that changes caregiving situations multiple times during the first year of life, whatever that may look like in their situation. When we have inconsistent caregiving, the child never learns to form relationships. And if a child does not learn how to form relationships, then connections are not made. And the connections that are made are weak connections. And we'll talk about weak connections and connections that are lost over the period of time. We want to build secure, strong connections in the brain that will stay for a lifetime. All right. When a child is born, there are approximately 100 billion brain cells in the brain at that point that are not connected. So here's kind of the way I want you to look at this. You go to the store and you buy a puzzle, whether it's 100-piece, 500-piece, 1,000-piece puzzle. Let's say in this scenario, it's a 1 billion-piece puzzle, okay? And it is your job as the puzzle master to put the puzzle together. And you put the puzzle together one piece at a time until you get the finished product. That's the best way to describe the infant's brain, is that when the child is born, you just have this big box of puzzle pieces. And one by one, we've got to put the pieces together, and the pieces have to connect. Now, any of y'all that have ever put together a jigsaw puzzle, you've got to get the right pieces to connect with each other. They're not all going to fit, all right? So that's why when we are first born as humans, really basically we've got involuntary functions, involuntary motor skills that take place, such as yawning, blinking, breathing, swallowing, coughing. These are involuntary motor skills that can take place. But other than that, really the only thing the baby can do is cry. They don't have a lot of control over their body. They can't take care of basic needs. They rely on their caregiver to help them survive. So, we've got to put those pieces together. Forming relationships and building a bond with children is going to start putting those pieces together. And that's why I say again, connections on the outside build connections on the inside. And the need for connection never changes. Now, I also want to point out that during the first year of life, more connections are formed in the brain than the rest of your life, okay? So again, that's why we talk about those first 12 months of development are so incredibly important, all right? Because what happens in that first year is going to set the tone forever, all right? Now, more connections are made during the first year of life than the rest of your life. However, we know that connections can be lost and connections can be changed within the brain. One thing we also know that during the first 3 years of life is when the blueprint for learning is created, and how a child will learn and how well a child will retain information is developed during the first 3 years. There's a difference between connections and blueprints. Connections can be changed and lost, blueprint cannot, all right? So even once we get past the first 12 months, we still have 2 more years of very, very critical caregiving, coaching, and teaching to be done. All right, so you can see my next bullet point right there, that by the age of 3, there are 1,000 trillion connections that are made in the brain. Now, I said that, some connections may be formed, but they also can disappear. What makes them disappear? Where did they go? All right. We know that the brain is a pattern-seeking organ. Okay, so again, if you're taking notes right now, that's another one that I want you to write down. The brain is a pattern-seeking organ. The more patterns, the more sequences, the more routines, the more rituals we can put in place, the more successful the child will be in life. All right, so lots of patterns, lots of sequences, lots of repetition. Remember, in previous trainings, we've talked about, in order for a child to learn a new skill, they must practice that skill 2,000 times in context before they get it. All right, so think about that from a classroom standpoint. When you're trying to teach a child a new skill, whether it be the infant room, preschool room, pre-K room, school age programs, 2,000 times in context to get that connection to stick and to stay. If a connection is not used, that's what will create, or that's what will cause it to disappear. So once we form connections in the brain, if something goes unused, it will eventually disappear. The connection will break apart. So that's why we talk about 2,000 times in context. It's kind of like going to the gym, all right? And I want y'all to imagine, going to the gym and working out and training and getting into shape for a marathon or to, learn a new sport or whatever it may be. When you first walk into the gym, you're not in shape, you're weak, you don't have muscle strength, and it's going to be pretty painful for the first couple of weeks. And then you work out and you work out and you practice and you practice and you become stronger and you become stronger and you're able to do more. That's the same thing with connections in the brain. You got to have a lot of repetition, a lot of practice, a lot of consistency. And the more you do that, the stronger the connection. All right. Now, just like going to the gym and getting into shape, getting ready for that marathon, once you get in shape and you're ready to run that marathon, you may be able to run that marathon successfully, but you're not going to stay in shape for the rest of your life. All right. You have to continue to go to the gym. You have to continue to exercise. You have to continue to stay healthy in order for your body to stay in shape. Even though you reached that optimal performance and you completed that marathon, if you don't go to the gym anymore, months later, a year later, you're not going to be in shape anymore. You're not going to be able to run another marathon. So that's the same thing with connections. You've got to have a lot of repetition or else they're going to disappear. Okay. The other important thing about connections and relationships is that as we build connections and as we focus on social development, and especially pro-social development, and teaching the children empathy and acts of service and how to care for one another, this builds more and more connections to the prefrontal lobes. And you want to create as many pathways as possible to the prefrontal lobe. So let me kind of show you what that looks like and what I'm talking about right here. This is really cool stuff. Okay, so you got here a picture of the brain, and hopefully all of y'all can see my screen, and you can see the picture of the brain. You can see that you've got your prefrontal lobes, which is right up here, and this is your executive state. This is where learning takes place. This is where playing takes place. This is where interacting takes place, all right here in your prefrontal lobes. Then you've got this blue area right here, which is your limbic system, which is your emotional part of your brain. This is where your brain is asking, am I loved? Am I cared for? Do people care for me? All of those emotions that are right there. And then you see right below it in red is your survival state, where your brain stem. This is where your brain is asking, am I safe? As we go through life, we're going to experience conflict. We're going to experience challenges. Whenever you get angry, when you get upset, when you get stressed, your brain will downshift, and you downshift from your prefrontal lobes, and you downshift through your emotional state, and then you go into survival state. All right. So when a child gets angry, when they get stressed, this is where they're at, is in their survival state. Okay. You want to create as many pathways as possible to get the child back into the prefrontal lobe. So it's kind of like, I'm in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I live here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Some of you, you're all over the state. Let's say, for example, you live down in Houston, okay? You're like, how do I get from Dallas to Houston? Well, right now, you jump on Interstate 45 and you head south and you go to Houston. Well, what happens if there's a wreck and Interstate 45 is closed down? Are there any other ways to get to Houston? Well, sure. There's a lot of back roads. There's a lot of detours. We can take 35 to Waco and then go through College Station and then get to Houston that way. We can take some farm to market roads and get there. Is it going to take longer for me to get to from Dallas to Houston? Sure, but there are alternate ways of getting there. Of course, Interstate 45 is going to be the quickest and easiest way to get from Dallas to Houston. It's the same thing in the brain, all right? Sure, you're going to have one interstate, you're going to have one connection that will get us from survival state to prefrontal lobes pretty quick, but just like in the scenario I gave, sometimes, especially right here in the emotional state, we've got obstacles. And we've got detours, and we've got roads that are closed. You want to be able to provide the child multiple different ways to get out of that survival state and back into prefrontal lobes. You want to create as many Interstate 45s as possible. That's where those connections on the outside build connections on the inside is so extremely important. By the way, just FYI, I talk about this in a lot of other trainings, but just throwing it out there. Right here, right in between your limbic system and your brainstem, so right in between emotional state and survival state, is what's called your CD-ROM. And that's where every experience that you have in your life, from the moment you're born to right now, is stored right here in that CD-ROM. 99.9% of what's in there, you probably don't even remember it's there. But it's there. The reason why I point this out is that behavior is defined by two things. Behavior is made up of temperament plus experiences. All right, so half of the reason why a child behaves the way they do is based on their experiences. All right, now of course, when you have a child that has a lot of stressful experiences, a lot of anger, a lot of negative experiences, their behavior is going to reflect on this. Our job as early educators, and especially those of you in the infant classroom, is to create as many positive and meaningful and loving experiences as possible, especially during the first year of life. So that way, when we jam pack that CD-ROM with strong, meaningful, and positive experiences, then later on in childhood and in life, when that child does get angry and they get stressed or they get upset and they downshift, hopefully they're going to downshift through those positive and meaningful experiences, and their behavior is going to reflect on that. Okay, so that's why we want to jam pack that. If you do have a child in your classroom right now or in your care that has had a lot of negative experiences in their life, there's nothing you can do about that. All right, there's no erasing it. It's there forever. Your job now again is to just overflow that CD-ROM with new meaningful experiences to help that child out. That's where the attachment figure comes in. And working in an infant classroom, working with young children, you are what is considered an attachment figure. You know, we all have that one person that we go to when we're stressed, when we're upset, when we just need someone to listen to us, when we need to know that someone cares and someone will take care of us. Even as adults, we have attachment figures, that one person that I know I can go to and they will be there for me. Well, for young children, especially infants, you are their attachment figure. When they get stressed, when they get upset, when their basic needs are not being met, the attachment system turns on and they seek out their attachment figure. So it's very important that they know you're there for them, okay? That their basic needs are going to be met and that the child is going to be taken care of as quickly as possible. All right, now I know that some of you, you're like, I'm working in an infant room, we're running a 1-to-4 ratio, there's 2 adults with 8 children, I cannot take care and nurture of all 8 of them at one time, especially when they're all screaming, they're crying, they're dirty, they're hungry. I get that, and we understand that, all right? And it becoming a secure attachment figure, you know, doesn't mean that you instantly instantly be there for the child and take care of that need. It's the basic fact that they know that you're there for them, okay? So the basic fact that they know that you're there for them, that's going to create trust and respect, that even though my needs are not being met at this moment, they will eventually be met, all right? So attachment builds trust and respect. It's also going to teach the children to be attuned to their surroundings, to be aware of their surroundings. And being attuned also means that they are aware that other children have basic needs that must be met and that they are not the center of the universe and the world doesn't revolve around them. And this is something that we have to teach them, that they are not the only person that attachment figure is assigned to. But you've got to have that secure attachment that they know you're going to be there for them. Now, inconsistency, having different people in the classroom, having a revolving door of turnover, is going to prevent the child from understanding attunement. It's going to prevent the child from having trust and respect because the consistency is not there. You know, children also are very, very aware of the energy of the room. So when the attachment figure does come in and they have a negative attitude, or when they are distracted, or when they're not mentally focused, that negative energy can be felt by anyone within 10 feet of you. And there's a lot of science that will prove that. So the energy that you bring into the classroom is also critical for brain development, because when we talk about attachment figures, positive and loving energy has got to be present. all right? You can still have a, kind of a controlled chaos situation where you have 8 babies that need attention all at the same time. But as long as the positive and nurturing energy is being displayed, the composure is there, the child is going to be just fine. Because they do have to eventually learn that, their needs are not going to be instantly met. But it's amazing how they will learn that they will eventually be met when they create and learn that they've got a secure attachment figure. All right. Like I said, empathy and acts of service are the 2 things that are established during this process as well. Knowing that there's other children that have to be cared for. And then, of course, eventually teaching that child that they are also responsible for caring and understanding not only them for themselves, but they care and understand for the other children in the classroom. And we're going to help each other in the classroom. Now, that's going to come later in the toddler and preschool stages, but it starts right there in the infant room. Important stuff right there. All right, let's kind of talk about our different types of play. And you've got 6 different types of play. Out of the 6 different types of play, you're going to notice that 5 of them are most common in the infant classroom. So again, in order for that brain to develop correctly, it is important as caregivers and attachment figures that we are aware of the different types of play and we support these different types of play. Now I'm going to kind of quickly go through here. If you're taking notes, this is definitely a time for you to take some notes right here. But the first thing is unoccupied play. Very common for children 0 to 3 months, typically. Can go past 3 months depending on the development of the child, but most typical 0 to 3 months. Unoccupied play is very random. It's unplanned, but basically you're going to see that the child is just observing and they're watching. This is where they're learning attunement. They're being very aware of their surroundings. So they're watching you, they're watching other children, they're watching interactions, basically everything. And believe it or not, this is a type of play. So when you've got that young infant and they're just laying there very content, just watching everything that's going on around them, that is play, all right? Now this is where, a really important thing to remember, and I've quoted this in other trainings, the way adults treat one another has a bigger impact on a child's development of self-regulation than how the adult treats the child. So the way 2 parents treat one another, the way 2 teachers treat one another, the way adults treat anyone that walks into that classroom has a ginormous impact on how that child learns to self-regulate. And when we talk about unoccupied play, this is one of the big things that they're observing and learning is they're watching and picking up on those interactions, all right? So it's so important that during the first 12 months of life, especially during the first 3 when you mostly see unoccupied play, that adults really practice composure and really, really practice cooperation with one another. It's one of the most important things that we can do for these young children, all right? A lot of people think that, well, if the baby isn't present or if the baby is asleep, it's not going to make any difference, and that's actually false. Even when the baby is not present, the way adults treat one another has a huge impact on the child's development because they pick up on that energy and what's going on. They're so incredibly smart. Solitary play is going to take place, could be 3 to 6 months, typically 6 to 9 months. during life. And solitary play is when a child will start playing by themselves. Now, typically with solitary play, the adult is going to initiate play, and then the child will continue on playing with them by themselves. So, for example, you put a baby down for tummy time, you give them a rattle, you give them a stuffed animal, you give them a soft book, you give them an action reaction toy. The adult will initiate it because they'll usually jiggle it, they'll usually hit the action reaction a couple of times, they'll get the child interested and engaged, and then the child will continue to play by themselves once initiated by the adult. That's what's called solitary play. It's short and quick also. Does not go on for very long because remember, they have a very, very short attention span, and they're also very easily distracted at this point. But creating solitary play opportunities in your infant classroom is big. And we're going to talk about that when we talk about the outside world and how a child sees the outside world. Well, solitary play is the beginning stage of the child's version of reality. All right. So that's a big one right there. So constant engagement with new and exciting things, creating that common interest, creating some of those favorite things that that child likes is all going to take place in solitary play. Then you've got onlooker play. And this is when a child will watch the other children play. So again, 3 to 9 months is when you're going to see this, but this actually goes on all the way up into the pre-K years. Through 5 years of age, you see an importance of onlooker play. This is when the child is just sitting there observing and watching the other children. This is another important type of play because, again, it's creating the empathy. It's creating attunement, that they're aware of their surroundings. But again, they're actually learning from the other children. They're learning from the adult. All right. So this is where, when you've got aggression in a classroom, or when you have a child that bites, or when you have a child that, pinches another child in the infant room, or pulls their hair, the way you respond to these type of situations is very important, even for just the onlooker. So the child was not the aggressor, they were not the victim, they just watched this happen to 2 other children. More learning takes place in the infant room by the onlooker than the victim and the aggressor. All right? Because the aggressor and the victim are involved in the situation. They're in their survival state right now. They're confused. They're wondering, why did this just happen to me? So not a lot of learning goes on at this point. The onlooker, on the other hand, is watching, they're observing, they're picking up on the energy of the 2 children, they're picking up on the energy of the teacher. So much is going on right here. So again, your composure and the way you handle these situations is important for all parties involved, all right? So you constantly want to pay attention to the way you interact and the way you respond. Parallel play, you're going to start noticing this 6 months to 12 months in the infant room. Parallel play is when 2 children will play side by side. They may not necessarily play with each other, but you can put 2 infants side by side, give them both toys to engage them, but then they will play side by side with them. So it's kind of a combination of solitary play plus onlooker play. So take those 2, put them together, you get parallel play. It's a very important type of play because they're engaging themselves, they're interacting with whatever object you gave them, but they're also paying very close attention to what's going on next to them. This is actually one of the beginning stages of pro-social development, which is a whole nother webinar that we can talk about when and how children develop social skills. Well, that parallel play is like step one, all right? This is also where children are going to start developing that common interest. Which children in the classroom like the same things, okay? What common dislikes do they have in the classroom is all going to take place with parallel play. All right. Associated play is when children do start to become interested in each other. They start working together. Typically, you're not going to see this until after 12 months. You could see it beforehand, depending on the development of the child. This is when friendships start to form, when those connections with other children start to form. But I like to bring it up in infant brain development because, once again, connections on the outside build connections on the inside. So the earlier we can start forming social development, the earlier we can start forming friendships with one another, the stronger the connections are going to be. And again, 2,000 times in context, the child is going to be much better off. Cooperative play is where you have two or more children working together to reach a common goal. So again, this is typically in your preschool stage that you're going to start seeing more cooperative play where there's a goal. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. And this is what we want to accomplish. That's a much greater mindset than what we've got in the infant program. But I still throw it out there so that you can just be aware of it right there. Those top four, though, are your big ones to support in the infant room. And as you're setting up your infant room, you want to make sure that you set up learning opportunities to include all of the different types of play. Okay. Now, if I was doing this training for older children, preschool age children, pre-K children, I would tell you that every learning center, all of your learning environment needs to be set up to support all 6 different types of play. For you in infant rooms, infant brain development, we're going to focus on the top 4. All right, let's move on down now and talk about your interactions and the way you interact with children. All right, now, of course, we want to be warm, we want to be loving, but most importantly, we want to be responsive. All right, again, creating that attachment figure that responsible person is going to be available to the child to help meet their basic needs in a timely manner. It may not, once again, mean that you're going to be there immediately, but you will eventually be there, and the child's going to pick up on that. We want that warm, we want that loving interaction because, again, you've got to remember these children do not have voices inside of their head yet. They have immature inner speech. So the only thing these kids can see are images inside of their head. There's no sound there yet. Now, once the child becomes verbal and they are able to start making sounds, so like when you put them in that bouncy seat, when you put them in the swing and you start interacting with them and they start oohing and gawing and making different sounds, they're actually creating the soundtrack for the images that are in their head. One of the reasons why we talk so much about warm and loving and nurturing interactions is because your outside speech becomes their inside voice. So as children begin to mature with their inner speech, whatever they hear on the outside is what they're going to start hearing on the inside. And so we want that inner speech to be positive. We want it to be encouraging. We want it to be warm and loving because that's what creates the inner speech, all right? If you have a child that is around a bunch of negativity and a bunch of yelling and a bunch of screaming, that's what is going to happen to their inner speech, and that's what they're going to learn that their inner speech is. So If you're taking notes right now, your outer voice becomes the child's inner voice, and I want y'all to write that down. So, how can I help support that? Talking, reading, singing. Sorry for the typo. I have signing to the child. Well, you can sign to sign language. Okay, it's supposed to be sing. Talking, reading, singing to the child. Poetry. Oh, poetry is so fantastic for brain development in the first 12 years of life. Why are all of these things so important when it comes to brain development? Well, remember I told you earlier in the webinar, the brain is a pattern-seeking organ. So the more patterns, the more sequences, the more routines that we can put in place, the stronger the connections. Well, when you talk about singing and poetry, what is the big characteristic of singing and poetry? It's patterns, it's sequences, all right? Also, repetition, lots and lots of repetition. Ask your children a lot of open-ended questions, and I know they can't answer you yet, but we still want to create that thirst for open-ended questions and that thirst for problem solving. So that's why we do a lot of the open-ended questions. But being in the infant room and developing that brain in that infant, you should be hoarse by the time you go home each day because you've been talking and singing all day long in that classroom. One of the most important things that you can do for the kids, all right? Establish and stick to routines. We've stressed that quite a bit already. Encourage play and exploration. And build as many connections as possible. I want y'all to turn this into like a game, okay? How many connections can I build in each child's brain each day? And every single day that that child is in your program, you have the opportunity to build connections, billions and billions of connections, all right? So it should always be your goal. And you know, if you really want to be Teacher of the Year, write that down on your daily report, okay? Tell those parents, these are the connections that we built in your child's brain today. When I played with an action-reaction toy with your child, I built connections. When I sang songs to your children, I was building connections. When I interacted with your child, I was building connections. And use those words instead of just saying child played on the tummy, all right? What connections did you build? And let me tell you what connections we built. So awesome stuff right there. We talked about the outside world. And it's very important to know that, you know, when children are first born, they are egocentric. You know, they do think that they're the only person on this earth and that the world revolves around them. They've got to learn that there's a whole outside world, a lot of other people that is surviving around them, and that what goes on in the outside world shapes the brain and builds the child. So in a infant classroom, you know, children are going to learn about the outside world using their senses, all right? And this is one of the biggest group of connections that are being formed in the brain at this point, all right? Seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, tasting, okay? Connections, 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 connections. So you want to provide an environment that has that is just like sensory overload, lots of things that they can see, lots of things that they can hear, smelling activities, touching activities, and even tasting activities. This is how the child learns about the world around them. Now, keep in mind that, you know, children, young infants, your 0 to 3 month olds, can typically only see about 12 inches in front of them. So when you're doing activities that involve sight, you've got to be really close, face to face, within 12 inches. If you're putting pictures in your infant classroom to help stimulate the brain, they've got to be large, clear pictures, at least an 8 by 10 or an 11 by 13 picture. And it's got to be close, down low, close to the child. Otherwise, it's not going to do any good. Okay. We also know that children start to hear out of their left ear quicker than they do their right ear. So as you're interacting to the child, leaning onto the left side is going to be better than leaning onto the right side. So just some interesting little tidbits right there when it comes to the senses. The touching is probably one of the most important sensory related activities that you can use right here in the infant room. So lots of texture boards, touching activities, and touching different types of things, and then talking about it and explaining it to the children. The other reason why I want to put such a large focus on touching is that the need for physical touch is always going to exist in development. And a human never gets rid of that need for physical touch. But during the infant years, actually during the first 3 years of life, there's a lot of research that now supports the fact that children cannot survive during the first 3 years of life without physical touch. Okay. So your job to build that brain and develop that brain is there is going to be a lot of nurturing, a lot of touching, a lot of hand games, a lot of massaging, a lot of hugging, because that's what the child needs at this point, and it's very important. Also with the outside world, I talked about 2,000 times in context for a child to learn a new skill and for that connection to be pretty solid. 2,000 times in context. I added this, the brain uses the use it or lose it principle. So if you build a connection and then you never use it again, it's going to go away. During that first 12 months, you've got to have a lot of repetition. So going back to the previous bullet point, experience through senses, all of your seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, and tasting activities, you want to make sure that you do it over and over and over again over a period of time. So again, we don't lose that connection. All right. And we talked earlier in the webinar about consistent relationships and having that consistency. All right, last thing I want to introduce you to, because I noticed that we're almost out of time. We only have 9 minutes left. This is a new term, and it is an actual term called brexting. Brexting is when a mother is breastfeeding their child, and as the mother is breastfeeding their child, they also have their phone in their hand, and they're texting. And so they're focused on the phone rather than the baby, okay? And they actually have a term for this. It's called brexting. Oh, it's so scary. What we're learning about brexting and what this does to the child and their development is some scary, scary stuff. When you've got a mother that is breastfeeding and they're focused more on their phone than they are their child, there is no connection to the attachment figure. There is no nurturing going on. They may be meeting the physical needs of the child by feeding them, but the emotional needs are being ignored. All right. There's a lot of negative energy that's being released right there. Really, really scary thing. Again, I could do a 1-hour webinar just on brexting. I just wanted to throw it out there and introduce you to this word, especially if you have parents that are breastfeeding in your infant room. Make it a no cell phone area. Definitely for caregivers, cell phones are prohibited. Parents, different story. But when that mom is breastfeeding, they've got to be focused on the baby so that all of the connections in the brain can be formed correctly. But share this with your family. You know, we're gonna see and hear a lot more about breastfeeding over the next couple of years and the impact that it's having on the children. So just kind of you know, stay tuned for that right there. Awesome. All right. Any questions or comments over anything that we have been talking about? Feel free to go ahead and type that in to your chat screen, those of you that are on the live webinar. If you do have any questions, feel free to email me. Feel free to give us a call. We are here to help you, to help your program be successful, but most important, to create successful children that are functioning members of society, to build as many connections in that brain that we possibly can. There is no such thing as too many connections, all right? No such thing right there. So I hope you enjoyed this information. It was a whole lot in one short hour, information overload right here, but hopefully some good stuff that you can use in your program. All right, very good. Thank you all very much for joining our webinar, and hopefully I will see you on a future webinar or online training, our weekend mini conferences. You can check out our website where we're going to be and what dates and topics we'll be doing. So those are constantly going on, plus lots of other professional development opportunities. Let Tim the trainer be your best friend when it comes to professional development. Y'all have a wonderful rest of your day, and go out and build some connections. Thank you all very much.